The silence in the boardroom was absolute, a vacuum where the only sound was the shallow, ragged breathing of the woman sitting across from me. She looked small against the backdrop of the sprawling city skyline, a withered figure in a fraying suit, clutching her portfolio like a life raft in the middle of a furious ocean. She had spent the last 10 minutes listing her qualifications, her hardships, and her desperate need for this position, her eyes wide and wet with a plea for mercy. She didn't know. How could she? The last time she, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, me, I was a sobbing child she had stepped over to get to the door. Now, I was the unshakable CEO of the very firm she sought to enter, and she was nothing more than a bad investment returning to the market far too late. I watched her struggle to maintain her composure, savoring the bitter irony that tasted like fine wine on my tongue. She, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, a savior. I, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, the monster who had taught me that love was conditional and disposable. Every wrinkle on her face told a story of a life gone awry, of a gamble that hadn't paid off, bringing her low enough to beg a stranger for a crumb of dignity. But I wasn't a stranger. I was the living, breathing consequence of her selfish ambition. As her voice trailed off, leaving her fate hanging in the heavy air between us, I leaned forward, letting the cold fluorescent light catch the diamonds on my wrist. The armor I had built from the ashes she left behind. I opened my mouth, not to offer the job, but to speak the exact words she had hurled at me 2 decades ago, ready to watch the recognition finally shatter her. The chill always found me first. It seeped through the hairline cracks in the window pane, a relentless, invisible intruder that claimed the corners of my room long before dawn broke. My room was the smallest in the house, a cramped afterthought at the end of the hallway that seemed to exist in a different climate zone than the rest of our home. While the radiator in the living room hissed with comforting warmth, and my brother Jake's bedroom remained a sanctuary of heated, plush comfort, my space was a landscape of peeling wallpaper and drafty floorboards. It was a physical manifestation of my place in this family, cold, dilapidated, and largely ignored. I pulled the thin, grey wool blanket tighter around my shoulders, exhaling a plume of mist into the stagnant air. It had been years since father died, and with his passing, the last vestiges of equality in our household had evaporated. His memory was fading, worn smooth like a stone in a river, replaced by the overwhelming, suffocating presence of my mother, Sarah, and her adoration for Jake. Downstairs, the floorboards creaked. The smell of frying bacon and caramelized sugar began to drift up the stairs, taunting my empty stomach. It was Saturday, which meant blueberry pancakes, Jake's favorite. I dressed quickly, layering clothes to combat the dampness that clung to my skin, and made my way to the kitchen. The warmth of the lower level hit me like a wall, a stark reminder of the division between my world and theirs. Sarah stood by the stove, humming a melody that felt jarringly cheerful. She didn't look up when I entered. Her attention was entirely focused on the golden brown batter sizzling in the pan, flipping it with the precision of a master artist creating a masterpiece. Seated at the table was Jake, looking every bit the golden son she had christened him. At 10 years old, 2 years my junior, he already possessed an air of entitlement that sat upon him like a crown. "Good morning," I said, my voice barely rising above the hum of the refrigerator. Sarah didn't turn. "Plates are in the cabinet, Olivia. If you want toast, make it yourself. I'm busy." "I smell pancakes," I ventured, though I already knew the answer. "These are for your brother," she said, her voice sharp, finally glancing over her shoulder with a look of mild annoyance, as if my mere presence were an interruption to her joy. "He has soccer practice today. He needs the energy. You're just going to the library, aren't you? You don't need a heavy breakfast for sitting around." I moved silently to the counter, retrieving a slice of stale bread and popping it into the toaster. I watched as she slid a stack of 3 perfect pancakes onto Jake's plate, drowning them in expensive maple syrup and crowning them with a dollop of fresh whipped cream. She ruffled his hair, her eyes crinkling with a warmth that never, ever turned in my direction. "Eat up, my angel," she cooed. "You're going to be the star of the field today. I just know it." Jake grinned, his mouth full, not bothering to acknowledge me. He didn't have to. In the ecosystem Sarah had cultivated, he was the predator and I was part of the scenery. I stood by the counter eating my dry toast and stared at the report card sitting on the edge of the table. I had brought it home yesterday. Straight A's. The teachers had written glowing notes in the margins, praising my diligence, my quiet intelligence. I had left it there hoping, foolishly, that the stark black ink of my success might catch her eye over her morning coffee. It had been pushed aside, currently serving as a coaster for the milk carton. A ring of condensation obscured the grade for mathematics. "Mom," I said, the word feeling foreign and heavy on my tongue. "Did you see my report card?" Sarah wiped a smudge of flour from the counter, not looking at the paper. "Sallallahu alayhi wa sallam it, Olivia. You passed. Good." "It's not just passed," I pressed, a desperate, childish need for validation rising in my throat despite my better judgment. "I got the highest marks in the class. Mr. Henderson said I have a real talent for—" "Quiet, Olivia," she snapped, cutting me off as she turned to pour Jake more juice. "Can't you see your brother is eating? Don't pester us with your school bragging right now. Jake, did you remember to pack your new cleats? The ones we bought yesterday?" "Yeah, Mom," Jake said, wiping syrup from his chin. "They're awesome." "Only the best for you," she beamed, the harsh lines of her face softening into adoration. I swallowed the last of my toast. It felt like gravel going down. I picked up the report card, the damp ring from the milk carton leaving a permanent scar on the paper, and folded it into my pocket. It didn't matter. I could have invented cold fusion or painted a masterpiece. To Sarah, it would always be background noise to Jake's existence. I retreated back upstairs, the laughter from the kitchen chasing me until I closed the door to my room. The temperature dropped instantly. I sat on the edge of my bed, the springs groaning beneath me, and looked around at the space that defined me. The furniture was a collection of discards, a dresser with a missing drawer, a desk scratched and stained by previous owners. The only color came from the books I hoarded from the library, stacked in precarious towers against the wall. They were my escape, my only window into a world where justice existed, where neglected children found magic wardrobes or received letters from wizarding schools. But there was no owl at my window. There was only the draft. I looked at the mirror hanging crookedly on the back of the door. Sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. A girl who looked like a ghost in her own life. Pale, quiet, with eyes that had seen too much coldness too soon. From a tender age, I had understood the painful truth that was currently settling in my chest like a stone. No amount of effort would ever earn her love. I could scream, I could shine, I could disappear. The result would be the same. Jake was the sun, burning bright and consuming all the oxygen in the house. I was just the long dark shadow cast by his light, stretching out into the cold, forgotten corners where no one bothered to look. I pulled my knees to my chest, listening to the front door slam downstairs as they left for the soccer game, leaving me alone in the silence. The silence didn't bother me anymore. In fact, in the absence of her indifference, the silence was the only thing that felt like the truth. The envelope felt heavier than paper had any right to be. It sat in my trembling hands, the cream-colored expanse bearing the embossed crest of the Design Academy like a royal decree. For weeks, I had stalked the mailbox, terrified that Sarah or Jake would get to it first and accidentally lose it. But fate had granted me this one small mercy. I had intercepted the mailman at the gate. Now, Sitting on the edge of my bed, in the smallest room of the house, I traced my name, typed in bold black ink. I tore it open. The first word was congratulations. The air left my lungs in a rush, replaced by a sudden dizzying influx of hope. This wasn't just an acceptance letter, it was a ladder let down into a deep, dark pit. It was validation. It was the proof that the hours I spent hunched over my sketchbook while Jake partied, and the nights I spent refining my portfolio while Sarah treated me like an indentured servant, had meant something. I had a future. I had a way out. I allowed myself a rare smile, pressing the letter to my chest. My biological father had started a college fund for me before he passed, a nest egg that Sarah, as my legal guardian, had controlled since his death. He had whispered promises of university and freedom to me when I was small, and though his voice was fading from my memory, the numbers in that bank account were real. They were my inheritance, my lifeline. With the letter in hand, I felt a surge of courage I hadn't possessed in years. I walked out of my room and down the grand, spiraling staircase. The house was quiet, save for the low hum of the television in the living room. Sarah was lounging on the pristine white sofa, flipping through a fashion magazine, a glass of Chardonnay balanced on the armrest. Jake was there too, pacing near the window, an energy vibrating off him that usually spelled trouble. When I entered, Sarah didn't look up. "I have news," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Sarah turned a page, the glossy paper snapping in the silence. "We're busy, darling. Unless the kitchen is on fire, it can wait." "It can't," I insisted, stepping fully into the room. I held the letter out. "I got in, the Design Academy. They accepted me for the fall semester." Jake stopped pacing. He looked at the letter, then at his mother, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Sarah finally looked up, her eyes scanning me with that familiar chilly appraisal, as if I were a piece of furniture that didn't quite match the decor. "Design school," she repeated, the words dripping with amusement. And I need to arrange the deposit," I said, trying to keep the desperation out of my tone. "The tuition deadline is next month. I need access to the trust father left for my education." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Jake let out a short, sharp laugh and turned back to the window. Sarah slowly closed her magazine and set it on the coffee table. She took a sip of her wine, savoring it, before meeting my gaze with eyes that held absolutely no warmth. "There is no trust," she said simply. The world tilted. "What?" "The money," she said, enunciating clearly as if speaking to a slow child. "It's gone." "Gone?" My voice cracked. "How can it be gone? Father saved that specifically for—" "I used it," she interrupted, her tone bored. "It was better utilized elsewhere." I felt the blood drain from my face. "Utilized? That was my future. That was everything I had. What could you possibly have spent $40,000 on without telling me?" Sarah didn't answer. Instead, she gestured vaguely toward the window where Jake was standing. "Show her, Jake." Jake grinned, stepping aside and pulling back the heavy velvet curtains. There, sitting in the driveway, gleaming under the afternoon sun, was a car. It was a sleek, aggressive sports car, brand new. Its paint a deep, lustrous midnight blue. It looked fast, expensive, and utterly obscene sitting there while my life crumbled. "A graduation gift for Jake," Sarah said, smoothing her skirt. "He needs reliable transportation for his social obligations." I looked from the car to Sarah, then to Jake, who was jingling a set of keys in his pocket. The cruelty of it was so precise, so surgical, that I couldn't breathe. "You stole my college fund," I whispered, the horror rising in my throat like bile. "You took the money my father left for me and bought Jake a toy." "Watch your tone," Sarah snapped, her veneer of boredom cracking to reveal the steel beneath. "I made an executive decision. We had to be realistic." "Realistic?" She stood up, towering over me in her heels. Let's be honest with ourselves. You have no talent. Not really. You scribble in those little books of yours. But do you honestly think you could make a career of it? You are average, unremarkable. Her words were physical blows. I took a step back, clutching the acceptance letter so hard the paper wrinkled. That's not true, I stammered. The academy, they accepted me. They shallallahu alayhi wasallam my portfolio. They want your tuition money, Sarah scoffed, stepping closer, invading my personal space. Money that is better spent on someone with actual potential. Jake has a future. He has charisma. You are unworthy of that kind of investment. It would be like throwing gold into a sewer. She reached out and plucked the acceptance letter from my hand. I was too stunned to stop her. She glanced at it once more, curled her lip, and dropped it onto the coffee table next to her wine glass. Forget this foolishness, she commanded. You can take some courses at the community college if you get a job to pay for them. But do not speak to me about that money again. It is spent. She turned her back on me, dismissing my existence. Jake winked at me as he headed for the door, eager to drive my stolen future. Nice paint job, right? He threw over his shoulder before slamming the front door. I stood frozen in the center of the living room. The sound of the engine roaring to life outside vibrated through the floorboards. It was the sound of my father's legacy being burned away mile by meaningless mile. For a long time, I just stood there. Tears should have come. I expected them. I expected to fall to my knees, to scream, to beg. But as the sound of the car faded into the distance and Sarah returned to her magazine, a strange sensation washed over me. It was the cold, hard snap of a severance. For years, I had stayed. I had endured the insults, the neglect, the Cinderella-esque servitude, all because I held on to the delusion that we were family. I thought if I was good enough, quiet enough, talented enough, they would eventually see me. I thought there was a place for me in this house. I looked at Sarah's back. She hadn't even waited for me to leave the room before returning to her reading. To her, I wasn't a person in pain. I was a minor inconvenience that had been dealt with. I didn't exist in their world. I never had. The realization didn't break me. It calcified me. The hope that had rushed in with the letter didn't die. It transmuted into something sharper, dangerous, and entirely necessary. It turned into resolve. I didn't say a word. I turned around and walked back up the spiral staircase. My steps were silent. Inside my room, I didn't cry. I pulled my old duffel bag from the top shelf of the closet. I didn't look at the photos on the wall. I didn't look at the trinkets I had collected over the years. They belonged to a girl who lived here, and that girl was gone. I packed with military efficiency. 3 changes of clothes, my laptop, my hygiene essentials, and my sketchbooks, all of them. They were the only things in this house that contained my soul. I shoved them into the bag, the weight of it reassuring against my shoulder. I looked around the room one last time. It was a grey, lifeless box. It held nothing for me now. I went to my desk and picked up a single photograph of my biological father. It was small, frayed at the edges. I tucked it into my pocket. I'm sorry they took it from you, I whispered to the empty air. But they won't take me. I descended the stairs. Sarah was still in the living room. The evening shadows were lengthening, stretching across the marble floor like prison bars. I didn't go in to say goodbye. There was no point in announcing my departure to a ghost. I walked to the front door, opened it, and stepped out into the cool evening air. The driveway was empty where Jake's new car had been. The space felt symbolic, a void where love should have been. I closed the heavy oak door behind me. I didn't slam it. I simply clicked it shut. The sound was final. I walked down the long driveway, the gravel crunching rhythmically under my boots. I didn't know where I was going to sleep tonight. I didn't know how I would pay for food tomorrow. I didn't know how I would get to the Design Academy or if I ever would. But as I reached the gate and stepped onto the public road, I took the first deep breath I had taken in years. The air tasted of exhaust and rain, but to me, it tasted like oxygen. I tightened my grip on the strap of my bag and turned away from the house, walking into the darkening street. I was penniless, homeless, and alone. But I was mine. The smell of stale espresso and industrial strength bleach had become my second skin, a sensory map of my existence that no amount of scrubbing could erase. My alarm clock was a sadistic instrument, buzzing at 4:30 a.m. every morning to drag me out of a fitful sleep and into the grey, pre-dawn reality of the city. I lived in a basement apartment that was essentially a glorified closet, where the ceiling was low enough to graze the top of my head and the damp creeped up the walls like a slow-moving fungus. The rent was extortionate for a rat hole, but it was close to the Design Institute. And right now, proximity was the only luxury I could afford. My days were fractured, split into desperate shifts of labor to fund the few precious hours I could spend in the studio. First came the coffee shop. It was a high-volume grind in the financial district, serving triple-shot lattes to men in suits who looked through me as if I were part of the machinery. "Hey, I said oat milk," a customer snapped, sliding a cup back across the counter with a look of disdain that soured the air. "Are you listening, or are you just staring at the wall?" "Apologies. I'll remake it immediately," I said, my voice steady, practiced and hollow. I wasn't staring at the wall. I was looking at the typography on the menu board behind him, mentally kerning the letters, adjusting the negative space between the A and the S to create a more balanced visual weight. Even while the steam wand screamed and the milk frothed, my mind was dissecting the world, stripping it down to lines, forms, and functions. Every rude customer was a lesson in patience. Every burnt finger was a reminder of why I was doing this. I wasn't just making coffee. I was buying time. When the morning rush subsided, I traded my apron for a janitor's uniform. This was the afternoon shift, cleaning the very office buildings where my morning customers worked. There was a bitter irony in scrubbing the marble floors of architectural firms I dreamed of one day leading, but I swallowed my pride until it tasted like bile. The rhythmic motion of the mop became a meditation. As I polished the glass partitions of conference rooms, I wasn't just removing smudges. I was analyzing the floor plans, critiquing the flow of light, noting how the shadows fell across the Barcelona chairs. "You missed a spot in the corner," the building manager muttered, walking past without breaking stride. "On it," I replied, gripping the mop handle until my knuckles turned white. By the time I stumbled back to my apartment, the sun had long since set. My back ached with a dull, throbbing persistence, and my bank account hovered constantly near zero. A precarious balance that meant skipping meals to pay for drafting vellum and high-grade markers. Dinner was usually instant noodles, eaten standing up over the sink because I had turned my only table into a workstation. This was where the real work began. The fatigue that plagued my body seemed to evaporate the moment I uncapped a pen. My cramped room, with its peeling paint and the constant thrum of the subway beneath the floorboards, transformed into a sanctuary. I didn't have the high-end software or the powerful laptops that my classmates flaunted. I had my hands, my eyes, and a terrifying driving hunger to prove that vision didn't require a trust fund. I poured my soul into those late hours. While the city slept, I built worlds. I took the grit of my daily life, the harsh angles of the fire escapes, the chaotic texture of the subway walls, the interplay of light and grime, and translated them into designs that felt raw and alive. I wasn't interested in the polished, sterile aesthetics that were currently in vogue. I wanted to design spaces that breathed, that acknowledged the struggle of existence. One rainy Tuesday, the turning point arrived during the semester's final critique. The room was bright, sterile, and smelled of ozone and expensive cologne. My classmates pinned up their renders, glossy, computer-generated images of impossible skyscrapers and utopian parks, printed on expensive bond paper. They were beautiful, technically perfect, and utterly soulless. I stepped up to the board. I didn't have a glossy print. I had a series of hand-drawn elevations and perspectives, rendered in charcoal and ink on heavy textured paper. The project was a rehabilitation center for urban youth, designed to look like a fortress of solitude amidst the chaos, utilizing raw concrete and reclaimed steel. Professor Vance, a man known for tearing students apart with a single sentence, walked up to my display. He adjusted his glasses, leaning in close enough to see the grain of the paper. The silence in the room was heavy, suffocating. "You didn't use the render farm," Vance stated, not asking. "No, sir, I couldn't afford the credits," I said, the truth slipping out before I could dress it up. And I felt the computer smoothed out the edges too much. This building, it needed to feel rough. It needed to feel made by hands. Vance turned to look at me, really look at me, for the first time all semester. He looked at my frayed cuffs, the dark circles under my eyes, and then back at the savage elegance of my drawings. "The perspective here," he said, pointing to the main entrance. "It's aggressive, it's imposing. Why? Because the world is imposing to the people living there," I answered, my voice gaining strength. "The architecture shouldn't lie to them. It should protect them. It's a shield, not a decoration." A murmur went through the class. Someone snickered, likely at the lack of photorealism, but Vance held up a hand, silencing them. "In a room full of polished fantasies," Vance said quietly, tracing the line of my charcoal shading, "this is the only thing that feels like it actually exists. You have a lot to learn about structural engineering, and your sections are messy, but this..." He tapped the center of the drawing. "This has a pulse. Most of you are designing for a portfolio. This student is designing for survival." He gave me the highest grade in the class. Walking home that night, the rain soaking through my thin jacket, the city looked different. The neon lights reflecting on the wet pavement didn't look like a mess anymore. They looked like a palette. The noise of the traffic wasn't a headache. It was a soundtrack. I was hungry, I was tired, and I was broke. But as I unlocked the door to my tiny, damp apartment, I didn't feel trapped. I looked at the stack of sketchbooks growing on the floor, the physical manifestation of my refusal to quit. I realized then that the barista job, the cleaning shifts, the sleepless nights, they weren't obstacles. They were the forge. They were burning away the softness, leaving behind something harder, sharper, and unbreakable. I sat down at my desk, picked up my pen, and began to draw again, knowing that my future wasn't something I would find. It was something I was carving out of the rock, one line at a time. The graduation ceremony was a blur of black robes and polite applause. A sea of faces turned upward toward the stage, beaming with the kind of pride that is usually shared. For most, this was a collective victory, a culmination of parental investment and familial support. For me, standing in a rented gown that smelled faintly of mothballs and someone else's sweat, it was a solitary checkpoint. When my name was called, the applause was polite, perfunctory. There was no raucous cheering section, no father standing on a chair with a camcorder, no mother weeping into a handkerchief. I walked across the stage, accepted the scroll and shook the dean's hand. The parchment felt heavy, not with the weight of paper, but with the density of the sleepless nights, the hunger, and the sheer, grinding will it had taken to secure it. This wasn't just a degree, it was a weapon I had forged in the dark. Walking out of that auditorium, I stripped off the gown and returned it immediately to get my deposit back. I bought a cheap coffee with the change and sat on a bench overlooking the campus, feeling a profound, quiet victory settle in my chest. I had survived, but survival was no longer enough. I needed to conquer. The early years of my career were not glamorous. They were a study in humility and frustration. I took a position at a mid-sized agency, a place where creativity was often strangled by bureaucracy and the whims of clients who could not distinguish between bold design and bad taste. I sat in a grey cubicle, surrounded by people who treated this passion as merely a job, a way to pay for weekends in the Hamptons. They had safety nets. If they failed, there were trust funds or family connections to catch them. I had the abyss. Every deadline I met, every project I salvaged was done with the desperate energy of someone who knows that one misstep means hitting the concrete. Your designs are aggressive, my creative director told me once, looking over a layout I had poured my soul into. Tone it down, make it palpable. Palpable is boring, I shot back, though I kept my voice steady. Palpable doesn't build empires. He laughed, a dismissive, comfortable sound. We aren't building empires, kid. We're selling toaster ovens. I quit. 3 months later, it was the most terrifying decision of my life. I had $300 in my bank account and a laptop that overheated if I ran rendering software for too long. My office was the corner of a studio apartment where the heating rattled and the view was a brick wall. This was the crucible. I stopped sleeping. I ate instant noodles until the sodium made my hands shake. I cold called clients until my voice was hoarse, pitching a vision of design that was sharp, unapologetic, and transformative. Rejection became a familiar flavor. I swallowed it daily. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The turning point came in the form of a boutique hotel developer, a man named Elias Thorne, who was known for eating young architects alive. He had fired 3 firms before he agreed to meet with me. I walked into his boardroom, wearing a suit I had found at a thrift store, and tailored myself carrying a portfolio that contained not just drawings, but a manifesto. They tell me you're difficult, Thorne said, not looking up from his phone. I'm precise, I replied, setting my sketches on the mahogany table. And I'm hungry. The firms you fired are resting on their laurels. I don't have laurels. I have this. I slid the rendering toward him. It was a design for his lobby. A cavernous, light-flooded space that defied the claustrophobic trends of the city. It was structural poetry. Thorne finally looked up. He studied the image, then he studied me. Hishallallahu alayhi wasallam, the fray on my cuff, the dark circles under my eyes, and the absolute, unyielding fire behind them. If you screw this up, he said quietly, I will ruin you. If I screw this up, I answered, I'll ruin myself. I didn't leave my apartment for 6 weeks. I lived inside the blueprints. I orchestrated every beam, every texture, every shadow. When the project opened, it didn't just succeed, it exploded. The design was hailed as visionary, a masterclass in modern brutalism, mixed with ethereal light. Suddenly, the phone didn't stop ringing. That was the spark. From that single victory, I began to lay the bricks of my own institution. I founded my firm, Ethelgard Design, not with a loan from a rich uncle, but with the check Thorne wrote me. I hired the hungry ones, the misfits, the designers who had been told they were too much for the corporate world. I led them not from a pedestal, but from the trenches. I knew every line of code, every pixel, every stress load. I demanded perfection because I knew the cost of mediocrity. Years blurred into a streak of ribbon cuttings and magazine covers. The grey cubicle was replaced by a glass-walled office overlooking the skyline I was helping to reshape. I walked through the open-plan studio of my firm one evening, listening to the hum of productivity. 50 employees, millions in revenue, projects spanning 3 continents. It was an empire. I paused by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city lights. My reflection was ghosted against the glass. Older, sharper, dressed in bespoke Italian wool. I thought about the boy in the mothball-scented gown. I thought about the silence of that graduation day. There is a specific kind of strength that comes from building something from zero. When you inherit an empire, you live in fear of losing it, paralyzed by the imposter syndrome of the unearned. But when you build it, brick by bloody brick, scraping the mortar from your own fingernails, you fear nothing. You know exactly how it was built, and you know that if it burned to the ground tomorrow, you have the skill, the grit, and the vision to build it all over again. My secretary knocked softly on the doorframe. "Sir, the delegation from Tokyo is here." I turned away from the window, buttoning my jacket. The solitude was still there, a cold core at the center of my being, but it was no longer a source of pain. It was the ballast that kept the ship upright in the storm. "Send them in," I said. I was no longer the student waiting for applause. I was the master of the arena, and the show was just beginning. Time is a peculiar architect. It builds empires for some, while systematically dismantling the foundations of others, often using the very bricks of arrogance to pave the road to ruin. For years, I had focused solely on the ascent, climbing the corporate ladder with a ferocity that bordered on obsession until I owned the ladder itself. My view was no longer the dusty corners of a neglected room in my childhood home, but the panoramic sprawl of the city skyline from the top floor of Vanguard Enterprises. I was the CEO, a title that carried weight, fear, and respect. Yet, even in the stratosphere of success, the whispers of the past have a way of finding you. Reports had trickled in over the years, snippets of information I told myself I didn't care for, yet devoured with a grim fascination. Jake, the golden child, the prince promised the kingdom, had proven to be a king of ashes. His descent had been spectacular in its recklessness. Consumed by self-indulgent whims and an addiction to a lifestyle he hadn't earned, he had treated mother's assets like an infinite well. He made gamble after reckless gamble, funding failed ventures and lavish vacations, bleeding the accounts dry. Mother, blinded by her devotion to her biological son, had signed check after check until the ink ran dry and the banks came knocking. The house was gone, the cars were repossessed. And Sarah? Sarah, who had once sneered at my thrift store clothes and mocked my ambition, had been dragged down into the undertow of her brother's stupidity. They were destitute. The irony was a bitter pill, but I didn't need to force-feed it to them. Life was doing a thorough enough job on its own. "Sir, the final candidate for the administrative assistant role is waiting." My intercom buzzed, snapping me out of my reverie. My executive assistant, a woman of sharp efficiency, sounded hesitant. She seems quite desperate, but her resume is surprisingly thin for someone of her age. "Send her in, Elena," I replied, my voice devoid of emotion. "And leave us. I want to gauge this one personally." It was a whim. Usually, I never handled entry-level interviews. That was beneath my pay grade, a task delegated to HR associates 3 tiers down. But something about the name on the file lying on my mahogany desk had triggered a morbid curiosity. Sarah Milo. It was a common enough name, but the background check attached to the application confirmed it. It was her. I spun my leather chair around, facing the floor-to-ceiling glass window, presenting my back to the door. I wanted to hear her before I sallallahu alaihi wasallam her. I wanted to feel the vibration of her defeat. The heavy oak door creaked open, followed by the hesitant, shuffling steps of someone terrified of making a sound. "Good afternoon," a voice quavered. It was thin, brittle, lacking the jagged edges of cruelty I remembered. It sounded like a voice that had spent years apologizing for its own existence. I'm here for the interview. Thank you so much for seeing me, sir." I didn't turn around immediately. I let the silence stretch. tightening the tension in the room until it was almost suffocating. I could hear her shifting her weight, the rustle of cheap fabric, the nervous intake of breath. "You're late to the workforce, Miss Miller," I said, keeping my tone low and smooth, staring out at the grey clouds gathering over the city. "Your resume suggests a life of leisure that abruptly ended. No references, no relevant experience. Why should Vanguard Enterprises hire someone who has never known the meaning of labor?" "Please, sir," she stammered, the desperation leaking through every syllable. "I am willing to learn. I will do anything. Filing, coffee, cleaning. I just need a chance. My family, we have nothing left. I have nowhere else to go." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of her reality. Abject poverty had stripped away her vanity. She wasn't the princess anymore. She was a beggar at the gates. "Nothing left?" I asked, swiveling the chair slowly. "Surely a family of such distinct pedigree would have safeguards. Where is the golden brother? Where is the doting mother?" I completed the turn, locking eyes with her for the first time in a decade. The color drained from her face so violently I thought she might faint. She stood there, clutching a frayed handbag with white-knuckled intensity. She looked older than her years, her face gaunt, her eyes rimmed with the dark circles of sleepless nights. She wore a suit that was clearly bought second-hand, ill-fitting and dated. "You," she whispered, the word barely escaping her throat. Her eyes widened, darting around the opulent office, taking in the expensive art, the custom furniture, and finally landing back on me, the man in the tailored Italian suit sitting on the throne. "Hello, Sarah," I said, leaning back and tempting my fingers. "It's been a long time." She took a staggering step back, her hand flying to her mouth. The cognitive dissonance was shattering her. In her mind, I was likely still the outcast, the unwanted stepchild she had helped torment. To see me here, as the architect of the very firm she was begging for scraps from, was a reality her mind couldn't process. "No, it can't be," she mumbled, her voice trembling uncontrollably. "You own this? You are the CEO?" "I am," I replied coldly, "and you are late." "I didn't know," she choked out, tears welling up in her eyes, tears of shock, shame, and terror. "If I had known, I never would have came. I swear. I leave. I'm sorry." She turned to flee, her hand grasping for the door handle, but her movements were clumsy with panic. "Sit down," I commanded. My voice wasn't loud, but it carried the absolute authority of someone used to being obeyed. Sarah froze. Her shoulders slumped. Slowly, painfully, she turned back and walked toward the guest chair, sitting on the very edge of it, as if ready to bolt. She couldn't meet my gaze. She stared at her lap, her hands shaking violently. "Jake destroyed it all, didn't he?" I asked, not out of sympathy, but to hear her admit it. "Yes," she whispered, a tear splashing onto her skirt. "He gambled the inheritance. He mortgaged the house without telling Mom. We lost the cars, the jewelry. We live in a one-room apartment in the East District. Mom is sick. She can't work. Jake ran off when the debt collectors came. And so the burden falls to you," I mused. "The girl who once told me I was destined to be nothing more than a servant is now applying to be my secretary." She flinched as if I had struck her. "I was young. I was stupid. I know that doesn't excuse it, but we are starving. I haven't eaten a full meal in 2 days. Please, don't mock me. Just let me go." "I'm not mocking you, Sarah. I am assessing a potential employee," I said, standing up and walking around the desk. I leaned against the edge, looking down at her. "You need this job. You need the health insurance for Mother. You need the salary to keep a roof over your head. She looked up at me then, her eyes red and raw. Yes, I need it more than anything. And you realize that if I hire you, you will answer to me? I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. Every day, you will walk into this building that I built. You will fetch my coffee. You will organize my schedule. You will see my success and be reminded of your failure every single hour of every single day. Can you handle that? Can you swallow that much pride? The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. I watched the internal war raging behind her eyes. The old Sarah would have spat in my face and stormed out. But that Sarah was dead, buried under mountains of debt and regret. The woman before me was broken. I have no pride left to swallow, she said, her voice hollow. I will do whatever you ask. Please help us. It was the ultimate victory, yet it tasted like ash. There was no joy in seeing her this way, only a cold, hard confirmation that the universe eventually balances its ledger. Very well, I said, turning back to the window to look out at the city that I had conquered while they slept. Report to Elena at 8 a.m. sharp tomorrow. Do not be late. And Sarah? Yes, she breathed, hope and dread mingling in her tone. This isn't charity, I said, my reflection in the glass staring back at me, hard and unyielding. This is business. Make sure you remember who signs the checks. I heard the door click shut behind her, the sound echoing like a gavel striking a block. The past had finally confronted the present, and the noise it made was deafening. The air conditioning in my corner office hummed with a low, expensive quiet, a stark contrast to the chaotic thrum of my own heartbeat. Across the expanse of polished mahogany that served as my desk and my barricade, sat a woman who had once loomed larger than life in my nightmares. Now she looked small. Sarah's hands, weathered and trembling slightly, clutched a worn leather handbag, as if it contained the last fragments of her dignity. She did not know me. To her, I was simply the CEO of a conglomerate she was desperate to join, a faceless figure of authority who held the power to grant her a lifeline. To me, she was the architect of my oldest scars. I watched her eyes dart around the room, taking in the panoramic view of the skyline, the minimalist art, the sheer scale of the wealth I had accumulated. There was a hunger in her gaze, but it was dull, muted by years of misfortune. She shifted in the leather chair, uncomfortable in the presence of a power she could no longer claim. Mrs. Sterling, I said, my voice smooth and devoid of any tremor. I had practiced this tone for years, stripping it of vulnerability until it was as cold and clear as cut glass. I've reviewed your application. It's unconventional for a position of this level. Sarah cleared her throat, a nervous, raspy sound. She sat up straighter, attempting to summon a ghost of the arrogance she had once worn like a crown. I understand, ma'am. I know my employment history has been spotty recently, but I have experience. I manage a household. I demanded excellence. I know how to keep things in order. I rested my chin on my steepled fingers, studying her. The irony was suffocating. She had indeed demanded excellence, but only to highlight my perceived lack of it. She had managed a household by ruling it with the reign of terror, ensuring I knew exactly how small and insignificant I was. Excellence, I repeated, tasting the word. That is a core value here. We require resilience. We require individuals who add value, not those who drain resources. She flinched. It was subtle, a quick tightening of the jaw. But I sallallahu alayhi wasallam it. She didn't recognize the specific phrasing yet, but the sentiment was familiar. It was the atmosphere she had raised me in. I am a hard worker, she pleaded, her voice cracking. The haughty woman who used to critique my posture and my grades was gone, replaced by this desperate supplicant. I just need a chance, a foot in the door. I can prove my worth, please. I have nowhere else to go. I looked at the resume again, though I didn't read a word. Aisha Allahu alayhi wasallam, only the memory superimposed over the paper. Aisha Allahu alayhi wasallam, a 10-year-old girl crying over a spilled cup of tea, begging for forgiveness, only to be told she was clumsy, useless, a burden. Aisha Allahu alayhi wasallam, a teenager presenting a report card with straight A's, only to be asked why she couldn't be more like the neighbor's children, why she had to be so socially awkward, so unlovable. Worthy is a difficult thing to prove when the foundation is cracked, isn't it? I asked softly. Sarah blinked, confused by the philosophical turn. I suppose. But people change. People grow. Some do, I agreed. But this company was built on a specific ethos. We don't hand out opportunities out of charity. We don't carry dead weight. The silence that stretched between us was heavy. I could see the panic rising in her eyes. She needed this job. She needed the salary, the insurance, the validation. For the first time in my life, I held the keys to her survival. I could have hired her. I could have revealed myself, played the benevolent savior, and watched her grapple with the guilt. But that would have been a kindness she never earned. It would have validated her belief that someone would always be there to clean up her mess. I stood up slowly and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, turning my back to her. The city sprawled beneath me, a testament to everything I had built. I had constructed this life brick by brick, fueled by the very inadequacy she had instilled in me. I had turned her poison into fuel. I'm afraid, Mrs. Sterling, that I cannot help you, I said, my back still turned. Please, she gasped, the sound of a chair scraping against the floor indicating she had stood up. I'm begging you, I'm capable, I'm not a failure. I turned around then, fixing her with a gaze so intense it pinned her in place. Failure, I said, letting the word hang in the air. That is a word you use quite loosely, isn't it? It implies a potential that was wasted. I walked back to the desk, placing my hands flat on the cool surface, leaning in. You speak of needing a chance, you speak of worth. But in this office, we look for something innate, something you simply do not possess. Aisha Allahu alayhi wasallam. The confusion in her eyes morphed into despair. You are looking for pity, I continued, my voice dropping an octave, becoming the steel echo of her own past lectures. And as I have learned, the world does not owe you a living. It does not owe you kindness simply because you exist. You are asking for a seat at a table you did not build. You are asking to reap a harvest you did not sow. Sarah's mouth opened slightly, her face draining of color. The cadence, the rhythm. It was the speech she had given me the day she kicked me out at 18. The world doesn't owe you anything. You are unworthy of my support. I don't understand, she whispered, though a flicker of terrified recognition sparked in her eyes. Not recognition of my face, time and surgery and success had changed that, but recognition of the soul-crushing judgment. There is nothing to understand, I said with finality. You are simply not what we are looking for. You are insufficient. I pressed the intercom button on my desk. Security, escort Mrs. Sterling out. She is finished here. Wait, she stammered, reaching a hand out as if to touch the desk, but pulling back as if burned. You can't just... Isn't there anything? No, I said. The word was not shouted. It was not angry. It was absolute. There is nothing for you here. You have no legacy in this place. The doors opened and 2 security guards stepped in. Sarah looked from them to me, her eyes swelling with tears of humiliation. She looked small, defeated, and utterly broken. As they guided her out, she cast one last look over her shoulder, searching for a reason, for mercy. I gave her none. I gave her only the mirror of her own cruelty, refined and perfected. When the heavy oak doors clicked shut, the silence returned to the room. I let out a breath I felt I had been holding for 20 years. My hands were steady. My heart rate slowed. There was no triumphant laughter, no surge of vindictive glee. There was only a profound, settling peace. I sat back down in my leather chair, the seat of authority that I had carved out of the bedrock of my own suffering. I had looked the monster in the eye and seen only a pathetic stranger. By refusing to save her, I had finally, irrevocably, saved myself. I was not the unlovable daughter pleading for scraps of affection. I was the architect. I was the power. And as I turned back to the documents on my desk, I knew that the legacy I was building was entirely, undeniably my own.